Good evening. Thank you for signing up. I'm Ken Lustbader of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project, and Max Dickson is with me from OLIN Labs, and we're going to be letting people in from the waiting room. We have an unprecedented number of people who've signed up for tonight's talk, so I hope you are getting penalized for being punctual because you have to wait a little longer, but we're going to be letting people in, and we have a lot of people, as I said, so it may take a little bit, but right now we have 32 people participating and another 16 in the waiting room, so hopefully we'll get this thing going. Since this was publicized throughout the country, it would be great to know, if you want to put in the chat, where people are coming in here from. So that would be something nice. And also what your background is, because we are a historic preservation project. This is based in New York City, but we're also looking at landscapes. And while we focused on landscapes, it's part of our documentation and history. And it would be nice to know that this is a equally sort of interesting area of exploration around the country. 41 people and 18 in the waiting room. We've got 3 people who are handling the registration, so hopefully we'll be efficient. We really appreciate your attendance tonight on a very interesting area of study and discovery. What's really interesting is that I'm from the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project, and Max is from OLIN Labs, and Max is working in the field of landscape design, and I'm in historic preservation. And the two of us connected a few years ago when Max was doing some work at OLIN, which we'll discuss in a couple of minutes. But it's been wonderful to see that landscape and queer spaces are having this intersection. Myself and the 2 other co-directors that are going to be here tonight, Jay Shockley and Andrew Delcart, started looking at historic preservation of buildings and LGBTQ history about 30 years ago. And that our project is really the sort of culmination of our research and interest in this that started as a small little sort of networking group years ago. And now we've morphed into this. So I'm just looking at the chat. People are coming from Syracuse, Long Island, my hometown, Charlottesville, Chicago, Dallas.
Philadelphia here. I'm joining.
Yeah, Max is in Philadelphia. Lynchburg. Our project manager, Amanda Davis, is in Richmond. Let me go to, I have to do something here, so forgive me.
We have Bozeman, Queens, Austin, Texas, Charlottesville. We have someone from Buenos Aires, Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, Toronto, Detroit. Wow, we're getting people from all over, which is amazing. We're going to be talking about landscapes and sites across the United States, and then we'll be doing a little bit of a dive into New York City specific sites. So we'll have a broad swath of the country covered in this conversation tonight. Good evening, everyone. Please keep submitting any questions or comments into the meeting chat. It's going to be monitored throughout the talk tonight, and we're going to have time at the end for some Q&A. So any questions you may have, feel free to just enter them into the chat. And this talk is going to be recorded, and it's going to be available for future viewing on the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project YouTube channel. Ken mentioned a little bit of what we're going to be going over today. But we're going to start with a kind of overview of the role of landscapes in queer culture, histories, and activism. We're then going to explore visible futures of queer landscapes, and also some landscape architects and designers within the field. And then we'll head over to Ken, who's going to do a dive into cultural landscapes in New York City and the crucial preservation efforts he and the project have been doing. And then we'll end with Q&A. So to start, my name is Max Dickson, pronouns he, him, and I'm a landscape designer and urban planner at OLIN. OLIN is a landscape architecture and urban planning studio with offices in Philadelphia and Los Angeles. The studio works internationally on projects ranging in size from large-scale master planning to mid-sized institutions to small urban scale interventions. We have projects in New York City, including Bryant Park, Battery Park City, Columbus Circle, and the newly opened Pier 26 at Hudson River Park, which you can see here. So within OLIN, we have a unique kind of research branch of the firm, which is called OLIN Labs. And Labs seeks to grow the impact of the landscape architectural profession through original research, thought leadership, and by building platforms for purpose-driven collaboration and activism. Since 2020, I've been leading a research and advocacy initiative called Streetscapes, which explores queer landscapes and seeks to clarify the crucial importance of preserving queer spaces, telling untold queer histories, and imagining new futures for historically and culturally significant queer landscapes. Streetscapes is also a platform to build community, form solidarities, and create visibility within the profession. We hope to create spaces for queer and trans landscape designers, architects, and planners to advocate, share work, and support one another. Visibility, research, and discussion of queer spaces and people within the field of landscape architecture has largely been missing from the profession's discourse. As Ken mentioned, he's been doing this work for close to or over 30 years. And within landscape architecture, we just celebrated Pride for the first time in 2020. And last year, in November, was the first time that the American Society of Landscape Architects had a LGBTQ field session at their national annual conference. So identifying this gap within the field, one of the goals of Streetscapes is to tell histories not being served by conventional landscape narratives. So as we start, I just want to kind of frame this conversation a little bit. In 71 countries, same-sex relations are criminalized, forcing queer spaces to be clandestine. For individuals in these countries, the idea of queerness in public space does not exist in the way that we are imagining it today. These queer spaces are necessarily private and oftentimes occur interior within the safety of a building. If they do occur outside, they are hidden away in shadows or behind the protection of foliage. Not long ago in the US, it was the same way, and in many places, it still is. And I just want to take a moment to recognize that the number of anti-trans laws being enacted across the US will impact the expressions within the built environment. And so I don't want to lose that significance throughout tonight's conversation. Public spaces play many important roles in our communities, most importantly, freedom of expression. Central to the mission of public space is the idea that all people, no matter the color of their skin, age, income, ability, sexual orientation, or gender identity, have access to and feel safe in them. However, that has not always been the case for many communities that experience discrimination, including the broader queer community. In spaces where queer people can be out and open in public, they often engage in code switching. Less well known is that some, trans people in particular, avoid whole areas altogether, nor are they the only marginalized group who can feel this vulnerability. My experience as a white, cisgendered man in public space is very different than that of a Black trans woman. In order to plan and design an inclusive and welcoming space, designers must tune into how people of different races, abilities, gender identities, and expressions navigate and use public space and design with these communities. As people within the design profession, we know that sites invoke emotions, connections, stories of people and what has happened in our past. However, in many cities throughout the country, these queer spaces, queer stories, and queer memories have largely gone undocumented and unappreciated. To put this into perspective, the first successful nomination to the National Register of Historic Places for significance to queer history was in 1999. And in 2016, the first LGBTQ national monument was designated. We know that place and identity are so closely linked. Having these physical echoes of queer identities in the landscape is incredibly important and can help queer and trans people connect with their own identity, reinforce a sense of belonging, and proudly acknowledge that queer and trans people have always existed in these spaces. As a community, the need for a preservation of our history, and in some cases, the reclaiming of history and space, in particular, the history of the spaces queer folks claimed, created, and helped to flourish, is vital to educating younger generations on where we've been, what we've endured, and to help to continue to foster queer joy and resilience. It helps us reaffirm the value of queer and trans people to public space. In recent years, there has been a push from professionals, advocates, and academics to help tell these stories, underscoring the value of preserving these sites and increasing the overall visibility of these spaces across the US. Outdoor public spaces are historically tied to the queer community and have been important places for community gathering, cruising, and sex, mobilization, and celebration. These locations, parks, streetscapes, beaches, just to name a few, are where the queer community have appropriated spaces for survival and existence, as well as for queer activism. Early queer spaces, as we talked about, were behind closed doors, where darkness and seclusion offered possibilities for remaking both the spaces between and the bodies themselves, like discos and clubs, bathhouses, and abandoned buildings. Activist movements, however, were the breakout moments, the spilling out of queerness into public spaces. Through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, queer folks increasingly occupied and queered public space and public imaginations, raising awareness and visibility through gay pride parades, memorials like this, the AIDS quilt on the National Mall, and protests. On July 4th, 1965, 40 gay and lesbian activists held the first annual reminder demonstration in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, symbolically held in front of Independence Hall. This was meant to draw attention to the civil rights still due to the queer community. These demonstrations happened years before the Stonewall riots. Through these activist movements and the push to advance queer issues, iconic, historic US landscapes became the stage. So as we can see, public spaces play a crucial role and are deeply tied to our community. Parks are places where queer individuals, particularly marginalized individuals, would go to escape oppressive homes, find their community, cruise for love, and belong, and mobilize to start the contemporary queer rights movement. Hammock Street in Philadelphia, which is pictured on the left, and Mission Dolores Park in San Francisco, which is pictured on the right, are two examples of public spaces that were and still are an epicenter of queer congregation. Public spaces that embrace queerness provide the opportunity to meet other members of the queer community, share the same space and stories, allowing many to experience queerness without shame or fear, often for the very first time. During the peak of the COVID-19 epidemic, we saw that public spaces often became way safer than homes or bars. In Philadelphia, Hammock Street became aptly known as COVID Alley, a place where queer people could gather safely, check in with friends and chosen family, and escape loneliness and isolation. This became a healing landscape that helped queer people survive another epidemic. However, we as landscape architects and planners have also been involved in the breaking up and disappearance of queer spaces. In Chicago, a US Army Corps of Engineers shoreline protection project removed the rocks that queer and trans people would gather at, and thus their place of community. While this split space was redesigned with new amenities, it was no longer the same queer space that it once was, and the planning process did not address the presence and needs of the queer and trans communities. In New York, we can see a similar example with the redevelopment of Hudson River Park and Christopher Street Pier. Public spaces have also been a place of transphobia and homophobia. They've often been targeted by police and others, resulting in queer people being evicted and arrested from one of the few places that offered them refuge. The image on the left shows a cut down tree grove. About a week before the 1969 Stonewall uprising, a gay cruising area in New York City became the target for local residents. At least 30 trees in the grove were chopped down over the course of a few nights to prevent gay men from gathering there. The incidents were reported multiple times to the police, but nothing was ever done, no arrests were made. The image on the right shows traffic signage near Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. This was originally installed to discourage gay men from gathering. In the 50s and 60s, gay nightlife in Philadelphia revolved around Rittenhouse Square. Here, men cruised the 2000 block of Delancey, Pine, and Spruce Streets. On the circuit, which became known as the merry-go-round, some men perched on stoops while others walked or drove. In 1974, Mayor Frank Rizzo put up the signage to discourage this merry-go-round by banning left-hand turns from midnight to 5 a.m., the time that men would typically gather within Rittenhouse Square. And as we know, public space is also a place of violence, especially for the most vulnerable members of the queer and trans communities. Queer and trans people of color, particularly Black and trans women, are some of the most vulnerable because of the intersection of oppressions that they face. This oppression and discrimination has a long-lasting impact on health and well-being. And as we know, research shows that queer people and youth in particular are at a higher risk of mental health issues, substance abuse, homelessness, and suicide. In 2021, 59 trans people were killed, a record number. And according to data from the FBI, 33% of anti-trans hate crimes occurred in public spaces. This is the highest percentage of all the categories. What is our role as designers to create safe, accessible places where people can be themselves without fear of violence? And I just want to quickly note the woman who set fire to the pride flag in Manhattan's Soho neighborhood, which just happened on Monday. So it's still very kind of real and prominent within our everyday lived lives. But with all of this said, queer spaces are fundamental to mobilization, collective coming together, and visibility. The opportunity for intermingling of different members of the queer community, the joyful atmosphere, and the normalization of sexuality and sexual freedom is incredibly important within public spaces. And as these spaces disappear, so do spaces of shared history, cultural memory, and places of possibility. So I'll just quickly talk about the Gayborhood, which I feel like a lot of us are probably familiar with. But the Gayborhood is kind of a really good example of community building and solidarity. Here in Philadelphia is the only formalized Gayborhood in the country. And these Gayborhoods across the US were formed after World War II, when gay men and lesbians were discharged from the military. They stayed behind in these major port cities and urban centers. And they needed to create their own communities for safety and opportunity. Thus, we see businesses opening and these areas where people gather are starting to form within our cities. Within the second half of the 20th century, the Philadelphia Gayborhood formed in the vicinity of Locust and 13th Streets, and the community and the geographical spaces it occupied played a vital role in both social and political struggles of queer people locally and nationally. And as these spaces have formed, strengthened, and become critical elements of the city fabric, the community building and solidarities of queer business owners, residents, activists, and politicians have allowed for the reclaiming of queer spaces. In 2017, San Francisco designated 6 blocks of the Tenderloin neighborhood as the Compton's Transgender Cultural District, which is the world's first ever transgender cultural district. But it was the result of the community taking a lead on identifying what's significant and unique and worth protecting within the neighborhood, and leading the conversation with the city's decision makers, ultimately in the face of redevelopment of one of kind of the critical key spaces within the Tenderloin. By naming the district, giving it significance, they were able to affect change, which saw the development of this cultural district. And in Minneapolis, Loring Park was historically a gathering space for members of the queer community, and in particular, gay men for cruising, since the layout of the park made car cruising possible, because in Minnesota in January, you do not want to be outside in the park. But it was also, unfortunately, a place of queer violence and trauma. It wasn't unusual to kind of open the local newspaper and see that someone had been beaten up or murdered within Loring Park. And of course, these were targeted for gay men. In 1973, Loring Park was chosen as the location for Pride in direct response to the violence against queer people in the park. And Twin Cities Pride is still held in Loring Park every year. So Pridescapes aims to speak to these intricacies and complexities of queer existence and public space, but also how queer and trans people interact with landscape and architecture and how they imagine and reimagine their futures. So now that we've kind of talked about the history of public space and queerness, I want to quickly talk about what we can do as designers, as preservationists, to really increase the overall visibility of significant queer landscapes across the country. And so these are 6 principles that we can start to use to help kind of frame this conversation. Obviously, this is just a start and a jumping off point for all of us to start thinking about what we can do to really start designing spaces that not only are kind of queer inherently, but are safe for members of all marginalized groups. So we can think about intersection of social justice and good design, how we can design for the margins, and really center kind of the marginalized groups. And we have to consider who a design is for. We can use history and culture to connect people to a site and consider histories less told. We have to think about increased visibility and access. And when we think about access, it's not just physical access, but also cultural, sensory, and economic access to spaces. We need to think about authentic engagement. We know that the queer community is not a monolith, and so we can't just design a space like it is. We need to think about an intersectional approach to things. We also need to think about inclusive infrastructures that reflect the community. How can we design a space that allows for a variety of activities, a variety of groups to all use the space? And how is it serving the community today? So we talked about some of the issues that affect the queer community, like homelessness, mental illness, access to services. So how can these spaces incorporate social services that the queer community may need? And finally, we need to think about a space for celebration, remembrance, and joy. So I'm going to quickly go through 3 different landscapes and talk about how these principles may be applied. So we're going to start in Chicago with the Belmont Rocks. So as I said, this was a lakefront stretch of stone and grass in Chicago, where the queer community kind of claimed it from the 1960s through the 1990s. The rocks were kind of a political statement. They were where art happened, where people would gather, and a symbol of the right to be in the space, to the right to exist, and the right to gather outside and in the sunlight. At a time when queer bars still had blackened windows and everything was very much inward facing. In 2003, as part of the US Army Corps, which I mentioned, had a project to kind of safeguard against erosion. They removed all of the rocks along the shoreline, and the image on the right is what they installed. And so this really kind of destroyed the queer community within Chicago. The gathering space, the history, the memories were kind of just all removed without any consideration and kind of that deep tie to the queer community. But it's interesting to see that today the space is very much different. It's gone through a redesign process that's really centered the queer community in the history of Belmont Rocks. So today there's a 2.5 acre garden, and it's the AIDS Garden Chicago, which is situated at the location of those historic Belmont Rocks. And it's the city's first public monument to memorialize the early days of Chicago's HIV epidemic and to honor the fight of those who continue to fight against the disease today. And so the first phase of the garden was completed in 2019, and that was with the installation of its anchor piece, a 30-foot Keith Haring sculpture self-portrait, which you can see in this image. And it includes unique areas designed for reflection, education, honor, and pride. And there's also this element of kind of guided narration through the sensory gardens through a AIDS Garden Story Archive. So a digital quilt of personal shared experiences that are accessed via QR codes on signage throughout the garden. This was designed by Design Workshop. The second space I want to highlight is Independence National Historic Park. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the July 4th demonstration called the Annual Reminders were kind of really the first kind of large-scale demonstration for gay rights within the US. And the question here is, what does it mean for queer people to march directly in front of where the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution were debated and signed, where queer people weren't even kind of considered as well as women, Black people, like these groups were never kind of considered in the original signing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And so looking at this space really is interesting to me because I'm based in Philadelphia, as well as OLIN did the kind of master plan and redesign of the Independence National Historical Park, which was completed in 2008. And so this was a master plan, design guidelines, as well as detailed site plans for this World Heritage Site. And the design integrates the contemporary and historic context of Philadelphia into kind of this modern park. So tonight, as we're talking about like historic preservation, as well as kind of contemporary uses of spaces and kind of the stories that are being told, I think this is a really interesting example of kind of the balance between preservation of historic elements, bringing in ties to kind of historic and cultural stories, but also bringing it into a modern day space that can be used by groups. The design reinforces the park's identity and mission of preservation and interpretation of the resources and stories that symbolize the establishment of a new philosophy of the nation. And included in the design is this First Amendment Plaza, which kind of interacts directly with Independence Hall. And this is a space for groups, especially those whose voices have historically been marginalized or not included, to express, assemble, and take space. As we can see, the plaza juts out into the landscape, drawing focus to it and placing Independence Hall as a direct backdrop. And so I think this is really interesting, especially as we look back to the demonstrations that happened in '65 of queer people right in front of Independence Hall, and how this space today still acts as a really important place for demonstration and kind of expressing and assembling people. So today, groups use it to kind of do performance art for marches and protests. And in 2015, it was the location for the National LGBT 50th Anniversary Ceremony, which probably commemorated the 50th anniversary of the Annual Reminders, the gay pioneers who staged them, and a half century of LGBT civil rights movement. So it was an honor to have OLIN's design to be the landscape and the backdrop for this extraordinary event that commemorated an important time in queer history. And then finally, I'll just wrap up quickly with the kind of inspiration for Pridescapes. And it starts with this powerful scene from Pose, which takes place in the early 1980s amidst the AIDS epidemic. So the two characters here discuss an island that now acts as a mass burial site. So as soon as I saw this, I was like, is this landscape actually real? Like, where is this? How do I not know about this as part of our history? But it turns out that a lot of people don't know about it. Hart Island is an island off the shores of the Bronx in New York City and serves as the city's public burial ground. And it is the largest natural burial ground in the US. So it's estimated that more than 1 million people have been buried on Hart Island. People are buried in pine boxes marked by name or number, and they're stacked 3 deep in a trench 3 feet below the surface. And each trench can hold 150 to 162 adults per trench. In 1985, 16 people who died of AIDS-related complications were buried quietly, alone, out of sight, and with deep stigma at the southern tip of the island. These, unfortunately, would be the first of many. It was a double indignity to die from such a stigmatized disease and then be buried in a mass grave anonymously. Even among the AIDS experts and doctors, nurses, and hospital administrators with key roles during the HIV epidemic, not much is known about AIDS victims on the islands. Who were they and how did they end up here? Hart Island has largely been inaccessible. In 2015, families of loved ones buried on the island were finally granted access after a lawsuit was filed. And in 2021, jurisdiction of Hart Island transferred from the Department of Corrections to New York City Parks. However, access to this landscape is still difficult and its future is still very much uncertain. And it also is interesting to note as we think about these landscapes and designing kind of for a variety of people that the HIV/AIDS epidemic did disproportionately affect queer and trans communities of color the most. And Hart Island is a spatial kind of representation of those inequities within the landscape. And so as we think about that, what does that mean as designers to kind of grapple with that history? And even today, it's still very much a reality. And I just want to highlight the Hart Island project quickly here. They have a museum called the Traveling Cloud Museum, which is virtual. And it kind of allows people to tell stories of people who are buried on Hart Island. So kind of removing them from the anonymous burial that they may have had. And is such an important piece of the landscape and history of the AIDS epidemic, but largely hidden from the public. What does it mean to designate this as a significant queer space? As a queer person, what does this landscape mean to me? And what does this forgotten anonymous landscape tell us about our past and futures? It provides us with an opportunity to grapple with cultural and historical neglect and think about our connections to those who lost their lives through our cultural and socio-political shunnings and the intersection of race, class, gender, and sexual identity. And then just briefly, I want to kind of connect Hart Island, which kind of is this AIDS landscape, to the profession of landscape architecture. And when I started doing Pridescapes, I wanted and needed more people like me to exist in the profession. And I started kind of searching for other queer professionals who are doing this work. But there's this lack of a larger community. And there are many of us who came before that blazed the trail. And I hope that it's that this initiative, Pridescapes, is able to honor those who couldn't be out in the workplace while practicing, or those who lost their lives during the AIDS epidemic. And importantly, as a profession, as we explore, Frederick Law Olmsted's legacy and landscapes, these two men come to mind, who are both critical to Central Park's redevelopment and who both died of AIDS-related complications. So as we reflect back and continue to forge ahead, how are we going to sustain and maintain ourselves within this profession? And how can we connect public spaces with visible queer and trans identities and stories? So I will leave it at that for now. And perhaps at the end, I can talk a little bit about some of the more of the work I've been doing. But with that, I'll hand it over to you, Ken.
Thanks, Max. I'm going to do a bit of technical shifting here and share my screen, so bear with me. And I've got to just move everyone's head and start my slideshow. So I hope this is okay right now. Everyone's seeing the screen? We're good? Great. Well, thank you, Max. And I want to make sure I can advance this right. So hold on for a second. I'm Ken Lustbader, a co-director of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project, and I'd like to thank OLIN for its co-sponsorship and wonderful publicity and this opportunity tonight to explore historic cultural LGBT landscapes. Recognizing this history provides a tangible connection to place and the intangible benefits of pride, identity, community, and continuity. I'm going to be using New York City as a case study by providing context and categorization of the various types of historic LGBTQ public spaces that we've documented. In addition, we also recognize those LGBTQ practitioners who historically contributed to and influenced the field of landscape architecture and design. Knowing about queer historic place-based narratives is important for the successful identification, preservation, interpretation, and planning of current and future projects. Bear with my cursor. Oh my God, pardon me. Our project was launched in 2015 by preservation professionals to document the cultural heritage of the city's LGBTQ community through historic buildings and landscapes. We not only recognize LGBT site space specific history, such as Stonewall, but the community's influence on American culture and New York City history. Our website features over 430 entries and growing that document historic sites and landscapes from the 17th century to the year 2000 that can be filtered by our interactive map that you see here, as well as the types of categories that we have. The website also features 34 themes or curated collections organized by theme, including public outdoor spaces and sex and cruising. In addition, we advocate for local, state, and federal landmark recognition and conduct public programs. We're a small team, so social media plays an important role in disseminating our content and publicizing our work. So LGBT people, often by necessity, have gathered and at times appropriated public spaces for socializing, protest, celebrations, community organizing, cruising, sex, and sex work. In New York City, most of these public spaces were contested spaces that were often on the edges of populated areas, desolate at night, and shielded with limited accessibility by structures or infrastructure. In the 19th and 20th centuries, dense residential living conditions, often with limited privacy, had men taking to the street for cruising and sex. For example, City Hall Park is the earliest known documented gay male cruising area in Manhattan, beginning in the 1840s. As the social construction of homosexuality expanded in the late 19th and into the early 20th centuries, there were limited legal commercial establishments to meet, socialize, and connect. In spite of the risk of harassment or arrest, outdoor public spaces were popular primarily for men, mostly white, to cruise and connect in the public realm. This is depicted in the 1932 painting by Charles Demuth titled On That Street, which is Sand Street in Brooklyn. This type of cruising existed throughout the city, including locations in Times Square and Harlem. By the mid-1960s and post-Stonewall in 1969, taking to the street took on additional meaning with increased visibility through protests and demonstrations that included many women and trans activists. While the bulk of our project's work has focused on extant buildings, we have documented numerous public spaces throughout the city. And this is just a smattering of the type of sites that we've documented in all 5 boroughs. In doing so, we have established subcategories of public spaces that, in almost all cases, include an overlay of oppression. These spaces include oppression and violence, memorialization and reflection, socializing, cruising, sex and sex work, protest, celebration, and places associated with design and public art. We're also interested in calling attention to the LGBTQ practitioners who contributed and influenced the field of landscape architecture and design. Many lived private lives while creating public spaces. For example, we're particularly interested about the lives of early 20th century women involved in landscape and garden design who were unmarried and lived in independent financial support from men. We don't know if they lived in homosocial worlds, but we welcome any information, especially for those associated with sites in New York City. Similarly, we are working to identify gay men who influenced the field, some discussed in this presentation and in Max's presentation. Examples outside of New York include Florence Yoke and Lucille Council, based in LA, who lived and worked as a couple and were responsible for the designs of numerous landscapes, as well as for some of the sets in Gone with the Wind, and New Jersey-based James Rose. When considering queer public spaces, there are various questions one must ask. What are the historic landscape characteristics and its LGBT narrative? How have multiple layers of history shaped the physical and temporal appearance and use of the space? What is the process to recognize the landscape and LGBTQ significance via state, local, or federal programs? What is the public process to address potential threats and advocate for LGBTQ inclusion in the planning, design, and interpretive processes? I'm going to now provide some examples of previously mentioned categories of what we've identified in doing our work. The first is an early place of execution, roughly located on Whitehall Street in Lower Manhattan, where two men were known to have been executed in New Amsterdam in 1646 and 1660 for sexual relations with young men. We also document places of oppression that have been memorialized. This street side in Queens commemorates Julio Rivera, a gay Puerto Rican man who in 1990 was killed after a brutal attack at this outdoor location. Rivera's murder mobilized LGBTQ activism in Queens and increased visibility in the public realm, including the borough's first public protests since 1969 and the first Queens Pride Parade. Other places include purpose-built memorials or places for reflection, such as cemeteries. The New York AIDS Memorial, dedicated in 2016, is in Greenwich Village, the epicenter of the epidemic in the city. We also highlight cemeteries, often through in-person tours, at such sites as Greenwood and Woodlawn Cemetery, providing information about LGBTQ individuals who were interred there by placing pride flags by their graves, similar to how the veterans do that in federal cemeteries. Historically, parks, beaches, and promenades have been popular for socializing and cruising. These public spaces coexisted with surveillance, harassment, and entrapment that, due to a 1923 New York State statute, effectively banned the public assembly of homosexuals, giving police the codified ability to control the public realm. Here we see South Beach in Staten Island, which, since at least the 1960s, has been a place of community and celebration, and the site of the borough's first Pride March. From the 1950s through the 1980s, the Brooklyn Heights Promenade was a cruising area that in the 1960s was the focus of police crackdown and curfew. By the mid-1960s, the homophile movement, the precursor to the gay liberation movement, became more visible through pickets. For example, the very first public demonstration for gay rights in the United States took place outside the US Army building in Lower Manhattan in 1964 with 5 people picketing. Contrast that to ACT UP's demonstrations on Wall Street beginning in the late 1980s that attracted hundreds. Post-Stonewall in 1969, the trajectory of gay liberation and advocacy for rights took hold. We document newly emerging places of celebration and visibility. What is today referred to as the first Pride March took place on June 28, 1970, on the one-year anniversary of Stonewall. The marchers, which comprised the largest assembly of LGBTQ people who ever gathered, walked from Greenwich Village up to Central Park. The project also looks at the contributions of the LGBTQ community through the lens of public art. Here's Richmond Barthé's 40-foot frieze in Brooklyn at a housing project. Barthé was one of the country's most important sculptors. And in many cases, such as Central Park, public spaces have multiple layers of LGBTQ significance. Emma Stebbins designed Angels of the Water at Bethesda Terrace in 1860 while living in Rome in a relationship with actress Charlotte Cushman. The statue is also featured in Tony Kushner's play Angels in America. The park, and the Ramble in particular, has been a historic cruising area, also associated with oppression due to the level of entrapment and harassment there. But it also exemplifies contested space that serves multiple uses by different groups, gay men, and bird watchers. The Sheep Meadow is where numerous LGBTQ celebrations and rallies took place, including the Gay Inn at the end of the first Pride March. And we recognize landscape designers and architects Philip Winslow and Bruce Kelly, who developed the rehabilitation plan in the park in the 1980s, as mentioned by Max. Thus far, the official interpretation of queer spaces has been limited. An example is Greenwich Village's Hudson River waterfront and nearby piers that evolved over the past 100 years with multiple layers of LGBTQ history. In the early 20th century, this area is one of the country's busiest ports, with thousands of transient men who, being away from home, allowed for social norms and constraints to be dropped to explore same-sex activities. After the piers were abandoned in the 1950s, the buildings deteriorated and they became the destination for gay male cruising and sex, popular through the 1980s. The ruins were the backdrop for unsanctioned art projects and the site of photography by such artists as Peter Hujar, David Bornovich, and Alvin Balthrop, one of the few, if only, Black photographers capturing images on the pier. It was also during the 1980s through the 21st century that the piers became a popular area for trans, gender variant, and non-binary people, including youth, to live, to seek community and protection, and socialize. Some of this was depicted in the 1990 film Paris is Burning. The waterfront is also the poignant reminder and site where the body of Marsha P. Johnson was found in 1992, and where Sylvia Rivera later encamped, seen here with her altar to Johnson in the back in that rear photograph. In 2008, when the area was slated for revitalization for the current Hudson River Park, there were protests about the displacement of LGBTQ youth and the erasure of this LGBTQ space. Those efforts received limited attention, and unfortunately today, while the new park and waterfront are beautiful, there's no reference to this rich LGBTQ past or the individuals associated in this area. As a preservation project, the connection to an authentic historic place is important. In 2020, Brooklyn's former East River State Park was renamed in honor of Marsha P. Johnson through the efforts of then Governor Cuomo. It's a wonderful acknowledgement, which will include interpretive elements celebrating Johnson's life. However, it's in a borough without ties to Johnson, or a place where she probably never went, or a borough where she probably never went. Wouldn't a section of the Hudson River Park near Christopher Street Pier be a more appropriate place to memorialize Johnson's life? In contrast, Stonewall, Christopher Park, and the nearby streets in Greenwich Village provide a better example of the site-based authentic commemoration and interpretation. As you know, Stonewall was a spontaneous uprising against a routine bar raid that took place from June 28th to July 2nd, 1969. It was a key turning point in activism that led to the growth of gay liberation and activism. While the raid on the building was the catalyst for the uprising, most of the activities on various nights took place on the streets surrounding the building and not inside. To address this issue, in 1999, Andrew Dulcart and Jay Shockley, who are now my project co-directors, along with research from historian David Carter, nominated Stonewall to the National Register of Historic Places using the Civil War battlefield criteria for listing properties. This was the first national register listing in the country associated with LGBTQ history. The first reason they used this criteria was to document how the ungridded street plan that included the Stonewall building and Christopher Park played a crucial role in the uprising itself. The boundaries shown here reflect how a game of cat and mouse was played between the demonstrators and riot police, who weren't as well versed with the area of the village. The second reason was that to ensure receiving owner consent, which is a requirement of the nomination, that it would be achievable, the city was most majority owner and they were supportive of the project. And you could see this on the right, the orange or red triangle is actually the federal toehold ownership of Christopher Park that allowed for the designation. Christopher Park, immediately across the street from Stonewall, is a public space that has multiple layers of LGBTQ history that continues through today. Since the 1960s, it's been a popular gathering spot for queer youth, the site of rallies, the location of public art, and in the 1980s was redesigned by gay landscape architect Philip Winslow. In 2016, President Obama designated the Stonewall National Monument using the boundaries that were established in the 1999 nomination. It is the first federal monument in the country associated with the LGBTQ history and remains the single one that was designated. I'm going to end briefly by discussing two historic queer locations that are currently threatened, both overseen by the city's Department of Parks. These are going to be very brief overviews. The first is the Vale of Kashmir, located in an isolated area of the Olmsted and Box designed Prospect Park in Brooklyn. The Vale, which takes its name from the Thomas More poem about the region in northern India, is the location of a unique geological formation that by the early 20th century was redesigned as a formal garden adjacent to a 19th century rose garden. And we have some experts on here who can correct my details here. These gardens were recognized locally, nationally, and internationally for their design features and rare plantings, attracting visitors for passive use. Today, due to lack of maintenance and investments, both are overrun and decayed, keeping the crowds away, but beginning in the 1970s, if not earlier, became a popular and at times dangerous queer cruising area, especially for queer people of color. Part of this history is documented in Thomas Romer's 2015 book, In the Vale of Kashmir, which was a photo essay of the number of individuals who have explored there and gone there for sex, connections, and so forth. Working with the city, the Prospect Park Alliance, the not-for-profit for the park, has proposed a multi-million-dollar restoration that will create a programmed active use of the space and by default, eliminate its original landscape design intentions and its queer history and use. It exemplifies the challenges and tensions of original and contested uses, proposed changes, advocacy, and stakeholder participation and interpretation. How does one recognize this layer of history and use, something that we can discuss in the Q&A? The second location is Riis Beach in Queens, one of the city's most historic LGBTQ landscapes that's been a destination for sexual freedom and gender expression since the 1940s, if not earlier. Its queer use is potentially endangered by the demolition of an adjacent hospital complex. Historically, beaches have been popular public social gathering spots for the LGBT community where they have claimed certain sections of the beachscape as their own. In the period before Stonewall, beaches were and still remain especially important gathering spots since few public spaces existed outside of commercialized bars for LGBTQ people to meet and socialize. The queer section of the beach is located on the eastern end of the federally owned portion, abutting a city-owned hospital complex to its north and a private residential community to its east. The hospital buildings, in a state of disrepair, were designed by McKinn, Mead & White and opened in 1915. As with many other queer beaches or destinations, the section is on the periphery of the public space and somewhat shielded from the public gaze by other beachgoers. The city plans to demolish the hospital buildings, which will make the federally owned queer section of the beach vulnerable. There needs to be proper planning and design to ensure that it remains a queer destination. There have been efforts to demolish the buildings since the 1950s and through the 1990s, and during the last push in 1998, there was no discussion of its historic LGBTQ past or advocacy from the queer community. In contrast, today, there are organized efforts to ensure that the city's redevelopment plans take the beach's significance as a historic LGBTQ space into account. These efforts have gathered attention from the media, elected officials, and civic organizations. However, with demolition permits being issued in January, it remains unclear how the park department will ensure that this queer use will be protected. I'm going to end where I began with this photograph that embodies why LGBTQ history and landscapes matter. It captures the love, joy, friendship, and fun at Riis Beach in 1972, 51 years ago this summer, that is still thriving today. It was sent to the project by David Bolt, who learned about our project online and who said his lover, Felix, dressed as Carmen Miranda, and his friends in this photo have all passed away. This snapshot is our archival record. Queer representation and history matter. So I'll end on that note and thank you for your patience here, and we'll open it up to a Q&A.
Thank you, Ken, for sharing that.
So are there, I don't know, I should look in the Google Doc. I think Amanda was working. Amanda Davis is our project co-director here. And so I'm not sure if there are questions. Oh my gosh, there are lots of questions. So
yeah, there are a lot. So we're just
sure. Okay. So
if you'd like to, yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll just briefly, I mean, since there's a question that's popping up in front of me about Riis. I discussed the buildings at Riis. The permits have been issued. I don't have any additional information, but there are groups that are advocating, and, you know, it's about visibility and a buffer and defensible spaces, and, you know, how that the Parks Department needs to take into account that issue and protecting that view, and not simply say because they're putting a children's park there, the queer people are going to be harassed to move someplace else. Let's see.
So I can jump in quickly,
Yeah.
Just quickly talking. There's a question about the Chicago AIDS Garden and what prompted the redesign. And I think it was started by one of the aldermen when he came into kind of city leadership in the early 2000s. He had this idea of kind of creating this space in the historic Belmont Rocks area. And he reached out to kind of one of the foundations, I want to say it's the Chicago Parks Foundation, to start kind of thinking about the idea, seeing if it would gain any traction. And so it was a lot of advocacy and work from kind of people who have been advocating for the space long before he came around, but it took his idea and presenting it to the Parks Foundation to get the ball rolling. And so they started doing community events and reaching out to people, and eventually the park design came about, and it is finally open now in 2022. So it took a long time, but it started from one of the aldermen who reached out with the idea of creating this space. Much how other, like the High Line kind of started the same way, of someone who had this idea, and then you just kind of get the ball rolling. And so I feel like a lot of the spaces and parks that we see come from a lot of advocacy and work from the community.
There was a question about, you know, historic preservation, landscape design, that there's a sort of mutedness about the number of LGBTQ people in the field itself. I think that may have been sort of original. Now I think there are more people who are out at work in the last 30 years, at least, you know, talking anecdotally. But it really does speak to the issue of sort of knowing the community's influence and the profession's influence on American culture and design and contributions that way, which is really significant. And that's our interest in making sure we're not looking at just the spaces, but the people who created those spaces. And as Max, you alluded to, how important that is, you know, for people coming up in the field and representation.
Totally. And I think the profession kind of has been muted, and I don't know if it's been intentional or if it's just kind of the way that things have evolved, but I'm excited to say that there's a working group of kind of queer landscape architects and landscape designers who are starting to kind of put together a national working group for the national ASLA level. And so I think there are going to be kind of more events and kind of more just opportunities for networking and connection within the profession moving forward. But like, as I did start out, like the American Planning Association has had a LGBTQ division for 30 years. And historic preservation has been talking about this issue for 30 years. And so within landscape architecture, I think it's just taken us some time to kind of focus on this issue. But we've always been within the profession and doing these designs and creating kind of beautiful parks and spaces. But now it's just kind of being kind of more vocally talked about, which I think is really great. And I think the new generation of people coming through school, it's been something that's been really heartening for me to see, is the number of people, students in particular, who are talking about this issue.
Tatum, a colleague of ours who works in historic preservation, is posing the issue of, you know, that as a project we're grappling with, which is even with the built environment, but with landscapes, how do you attribute, significance and heritage details, character finding features that we're also sort of familiar with in the toolbox of historic preservation to sites that are temporal or have no architectural significance, but purely there for cultural, social, historical reasons. And I think, we've been dealing with that and trying to sort of shoehorn in LGBT history with those sites by nominating sites to the National Register for those reasons. But it does create a bit of challenge, I imagine, especially with landscapes. It's even more challenging because when you're dealing with a historic landscape, you've already sort of grappled with changes to that landscape, but then you're dealing with changes of use. But I wish I had the answer to that question. I don't know if Jay or Andrew or Amanda want to chime in, but Jay, you can, I think, unmute yourself.
I'd just like to point out something that our project's been doing through our National Register nominations, which probably would apply to landscapes that are already on the National Register of Historic Places or higher up things, which is, it's been relatively recent around the founding of our project that you can do cultural overlays on prior nominated places. So I think that would be a terrific idea. I mean, for instance, Central Park, Prospect Park, all of the Olmsted Parks are on the National Register of Historic Places. Some of them are probably National Historic Landmarks, but the National Park Service now allows cultural overlays. Speaking about a huge landscape in the broadest context, we got a 2-year grant from the National Park Service. We're currently doing a cultural overlay on the original Greenwich Village Historic District from 1969. So we're really going to suss out the, LGBT history of that from the 19th and 20th centuries up to the 1990s. So I just think it's a terrific tool, the cultural overlay that we can do.
And I think just tying that back to kind of one of the other questions that was asked about like the neighborhoods disappearing. And I know in Philadelphia, so the only formalized neighborhood within the country, but then in the past couple of years, there's been a shift of kind of a rebranding that's been going on. And so it's kind of traditionally been called the neighborhood, but now it's been rebranded as Midtown Village. And so there's been a lot of kind of new developments that have been happening within the Philadelphia, kind of that proximity. And so now the city is looking to do some sort of like cultural kind of overlay or district overlay that would sort of start protecting the kind of integrity of the neighborhood and what it kind of used to be, but kind of thinking of different ways that they can start to kind of still recognize and keep kind of the identity of the neighborhood as it goes through the changes that it seems like other cities are going through, where these kind of spaces are disappearing, like in DC and Boston, someone commented. So I think that's another interesting thing of what other tools do we have to start thinking about kind of larger districts or areas within our cities.
There was a question on guidelines, Nicola, blueprints, guidelines on how to organize and designate neighborhoods and area or buildings as an LGBTQ space. I think you could look at our project, go to our website and see sort of how we've applied preservation tools and regulations and practices to that area. And as Jay just was discussing, how we've used the amendment sort of path to do amendments that have been quite successful. There's also, groups around the country that are doing this and working, whether they're individuals or working with a not-for-profit, or they're an archive or a library looking at their own collections and trying to impart, what do they have there that's associated and connected to the built environment or the landscape. So, but there's no one-stop shop, which maybe that's a thing that we've put together, a little briefing on this. And that, I think we answered, I hope, Kayla's question about, how to use historic preservation tools to document and designate existing buildings or landmarks.
There's a question of how we can uplift rural LGBTQ landscapes, and I think that's a really great question. And I don't know the answer to that, but I feel like it's easier. We have a lot more kind of history and stories and kind of connections to kind of like these more urban contexts and sites. But I know that kind of rural queer landscapes exist, and so I think that's something that, as we're moving forward, or that as people are interested in the subject, I think that's a great thing to start looking at, because we do know that these spaces exist all over the US, all over the world, and starting to kind of map and document them. And I wish there's this resource that it's a online mapping platform where people can put in, I'll see if I can find it while we're still online, but where people can put in like different spots and map it. And it's just amazing to kind of see the whole United States and across the world, people kind of documenting these queer landscapes and queer spaces all over. But I do think that's kind of the ruralness of it is something that I'm interested in exploring and seeing kind of what that looks like and where they are, and just getting kind of more recognition of all these spaces across the US.
There are a couple of questions that are being put in the Google Doc for us. One is about Riis Beach and threatened spaces, before being defensive and reactive rather than proactive. What could someone learn from activists around the site like Riis Beach and what they're doing now to protect their significant sites earlier than later? I think even, it's a political advocacy question. I think it's great that Glitz is working to advocate for Riis. They got the involvement of the Municipal Art Society in New York. They got a lot of press. There are reporters who are interested in tracking it. But I do think, we're LGBTQ people, queer people are, sexual sort of minorities and other, and I don't think people are understanding the importance of these historic places, hence the need to take our own locations and spaces as historic and the use of them significant and important. So I think, it's great that I think it's a case study. The Vale of Kashmir is another issue because, as there's another question that's posed, how do you deal with this layered significance, the original design of the park? It's a cruising space. Preserving one would compromise or erase the other. Yes, those are all true. And that's the conundrum right now in terms of what we presented. However, I mean, Max, you alluded to sort of you described a project that talked about, the Keith Haring sculptures. And, when I was thinking about the Vale of Kashmir, it's a separate issue. They're changing it to a program space. You're taking a historic, passive, gorgeous garden that has, important location for vision that was a 19th century vision, and completely changing that and eradicating that part of the park. So, but then there's this, so that's a separate issue from the queer use of it now. And if there was an understanding of that being an important queer space for people of color, queer people of color, couldn't there be a design conversation that recognizes its past? It doesn't have to preserve it necessarily. I'm not saying it should or it shouldn't, but how do you interpret it? Is there a better way to have sort of a passive area? I'm thinking of memorializing, like, in Golden Gate Park, the Grove, and how they've, created this gorgeous space to recognize the people who died of HIV complications in San Francisco. So again, we're just touching the tip of the iceberg here with solutions, but I just think it needs to be part of the conversation proactively. I think Amanda is typing something for me. Oh, there's a question. Have there been possibility of developing multiple property documentation forms to NR to help streamline, make it easier? For instance, there was, yes, Asian American Pacific Islanders cultural multiple property submission. yes, I think in California they've been doing that, and maybe Jay or Andrew can answer this. We multiple property submission. We talked about it for our project here, and we didn't go that route. But there have been conversations about that. And the other part of this conversation, in terms of documenting and understanding this history, there have been a number of historic context statements developed for cities in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Louisville, and so forth. So that is also a good tool to at least call out this narrative that people in the profession can use, and people who are enthusiasts, academics, students, and so forth. I think the goal for this presentation is to really bring people's sort of awareness to this issue and change perceptions that, landscapes are really important, queer landscapes are important, and how do we grapple with them? There's a question about any activity in DC in regards to queer spaces. I believe there is a DC. I know there's the Rainbow Heritage Network, which is based in DC, but I don't know specifically. There are disparate projects all around the country looking at this issue of sites and places.
Ken or Max, could you speak specifically about any Dyke public spaces? This was asked in the chat. The Dyke March we had?
Yeah, we had the Dyke March that, is in Washington Square Park, and on the Pride Parade. I think what we touched on are some of the protests that happened in the early, 1970s. And then, in some ways, I'm just thinking out loud here for our project, there was the Lesbian Avengers went to the Alice Austin House and protested there in the 1990s, I believe, because they wanted Alice Austin's queer past to be sort of included there. We may want to include that on our website entry. But it does speak to, what's that? We do, okay.
We do.
See? Right.
Yeah,
but we may want to categorize it a little differently as a public space or something.
Well, don't forget the Lesbian Avengers in front of the Museum of Natural History.
Right.
With the purple dinosaur to protest the depiction of animals inside.
Well, I have to add that to the presentation for next time, but true. But in terms of cruising and meeting, that's a different animal versus protest and sort of celebration.
You could also look at maybe the Lavender Menace action. It was in a public school, but it was a public space disrupting the NOW conference to recognize lesbian influence in the wider women's rights movement. So these are all documented on our website, by the way, if you'd like to learn more about each of these.
And I'll just add, this is another, not example of gathering space, but kind of protest. The Philadelphia annual demonstrations were led by a lesbian woman. And so I do want to kind of acknowledge that. But again, an example of a protest and not a gathering space.
And the first, the Brooklyn Pride March was organized in the late 1990s, and the first evening Brooklyn Pride March was organized by a lesbian of color. And we have that on our website as well for further information.
And Queens was co-led by a woman.
Dyke Slope, for example, Park Slope being known as Dyke Slope for its large lesbian community in the 1990s in particular.
And there was a question, yes, about the Dyke protest, but what about ongoing gathering spaces? We have historic gathering spaces, but as a project, we go from the 17th century, if not earlier, up to 2000. So our project has a number of historic lesbian gathering spaces throughout the New York City area. And I'm glad to hear that the National Parks Conservation Association is working with the groups to help coordinating advocacy efforts at Riis. Yes, someone asked mentioned the AIDS walk in Central Park, right? To categorize that as a number of things. I mean, as you can see, we've got, it's an ambitious project that we're doing in New York City because we're looking at everything. And it's really got this sort of queer overlay to show people visibility that there is this life here.
And maybe after this we can wrap up, but a question of any advice of soliciting LGBTQ knowledge and stories from community, especially more hidden stories, and building them into place? That's a really great question. And I think starting with kind of existing organizations or resources within your own community. So I'm thinking of like community centers or like NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. Like when I was starting my research, I stumbled upon them and was able to start kind of unraveling into kind of all these stories and histories. But I think starting to look into kind of your community resources that may be there, or people within the community who are doing similar type of work, and starting kind of there and then branching out, I think is something that was helpful for me as I was starting to think about knowledge and stories from kind of the Philadelphia community.
And in a, I don't want to say bizarre way, social media, like for example, Instagram has a number of accounts that, you know, depending on accuracy and so forth, are sort of handling, you know, LGBTQ past. And that may be just a good area to look at what people are doing and what resources they're using in their community. The other part about going is just searching online. There are so many digital archives now. There's the digital trans archive. There's the Gale, which is about sexual, you know, all over. You can just start going and finding information that may lead you to different archives and resources. Well, I think it's 7:48. So I think in the interest of time and everybody's time, thank you for coming. Max, if you have any closing comments you want to make, I want to thank you for calling me a couple of months ago about doing a presentation and that we could redo it here, which is great. So thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for helping to organize this and just being a valuable resource, I know, for so many people within New York and across the country. And thank you everyone for attending. I know someone made a comment earlier about thank you for doing this event and not just in June. So I think that's also something that we need to kind of do, is make sure that we're kind of visible throughout the entire year and not just during Pride Month. So thank you all for attending.
Thank you. And thanks our social media team and my colleagues from the project for doing this, and tell your friends at OLIN, thanks for getting this record crowd here. So thanks everybody and have a good night.
Please everybody keep, if with our project in particular, we're doing some events coming up over the next few months. So keep tuned to our website.
Mm-hmm. Take care.
We have upcoming events being planned.
And follow us on social media at NYC LGBT Sites. Thanks.